Welcome back to Backyard Ballistics. In this episode, I will talk about a scary accident I witnessed involving a Glock 32 randomly going full auto. I will also show you what the problem was, talk a little about the functioning of Glocks, and then test shoot the gun once it has been fixed. When the accident happened, I wasn't of course filming it. What you see here are tests to see if the accident occurred again, and of course it did. When you least expect it, a burst of a few rounds is shot, and it doesn't happen all the times. In the video I only included the occasions in which the gun went full auto. It is obvious that this situation is extremely dangerous and needs to be taken care of with great attention. When I disassembled the gun, I didn't notice anything strange in it. The trigger mechanism was perfectly fine, and there were no missing or damaged parts in the frame. The slide looked flawless as well, but when I touched the trigger safety button, I felt something strange. Instead of moving back and forth with little effort, it was quite hard to push in and didn't feel like you were pushing only against its return spring. I then decided to take it out to look for some anomalies, and in fact I found a very weird one. Once I had removed the button with its return spring, I saw that something was stuck at the bottom of the hole. Upon further looking, it came out to be the piece of a spring just casually laying down there. I removed it with a pair of pliers and checked if there was a missing spring somewhere, but with no success. Apparently, that spring was just a rogue piece accidentally fallen down there while the gun was disassembled, and this would explain why the trigger safety button was so hard to push down. Once the gun was reassembled, the safety button felt normal, as in any other Glock, and was finally free to move back and forth like it was supposed to. The gun was later carefully tested and showed regular functioning. Since the gun is now fixed and safe, I am going to review and test it a little bit. First, what I think is interesting is the caliber. This gun is chambered in 357 SIG, which not only is an interesting cartridge by itself, but also shares all of the gun parts with the only exception of the barrel with the more common 40 Smith & Wesson. This means that you can change from one caliber to the other by just swapping the barrel on your gun, which is quite cool. Also, the cartridge was designed to be totally foolproof. If you try to insert a 40 cal cartridge in the 357 barrel, it wouldn't fit at all, making it impossible to accidentally fire an oversized bullet. For the rest, this is just a regular Glock handgun, and I am sure you have already seen plenty of them, so without further ado, let's see what this gun can do at 25 meters. I am going for accuracy, so I am taking my time. The cartridges that I am shooting are just factory loads, and particularly American Eagle 125 grains full metal jackets. I have to admit that it is a pretty comfortable gun to shoot. If you have already watched my latest video, calculating gun recoil, you will also understand why this shouldn't surprise. We've got slightly less energy than a 40 Smith & Wesson with a much lighter bullet, so our recoil energy is going to be somewhere in between that of the 9mm and the 40 Smith & Wesson. On the other hand, the muzzle blast is bigger because of the higher muzzle pressure. Also, the bullet is supersonic, and if you pay attention you can actually hear the sonic boom. Anyway, let's have a look at the target. As usual, I was aiming at the base of the black circle, and I got a pretty tight group. To be honest, it is one of the tightest groups I have ever shot with a Glock. And to make sure I wasn't just being lucky, I went back and shot another 5 rounds, which again did pretty good. The lowest hole was already on target, and I didn't notice it. Even if it wasn't though, it would still be a nice grouping. Satisfied by the results obtained with the 357 SIG, I decided to swap the barrel with the 40 Smith & Wesson one and try it again. Notice the absence of the sonic boom this time, since the bullet is subsonic. Here's one of the 357 shots. And here are the 40s. The cartridges were hand loads, and they were using a copper-plated 180 grains bullet. This time the target result was definitely worse though, and when I tried another 5-round series I still got a pretty large group. Also, the fact that the group is thin and vertical indicates that something is wrong with the gun or the ammo. The first thing that came to my mind was a large deviation in muzzle velocity, which influences the barrel time and consequently the height of the point of impact. But when I chronographed the velocity, I got pretty consistent results, so I am not really sure on what caused the large grouping. I am worried that it might be due to the fact that the barrels are not really designed to be interchanged, but that would need further testing. Now that we've had fun, let's go back to how a Glock trigger mechanism works and understand why the obstruction of the trigger block seat caused it to go full auto. The trigger bar that is attached to the trigger itself is moved backwards during the trigger stroke, and doing that it pushes the tail of the firing pin back, compressing its spring. Once it reaches the end of the stroke, the trigger bar touches the connector slope, and to follow that it moves downwards, releasing the firing pin so that it can be accelerated by its spring to hit the primer of the cartridge. Once that is done, the shot is fired and the slide starts moving back. During this movement, this protrusion on the slide hits the connector, moving it to the left. This is the action that resets the trigger, since it allows the trigger bar to come back up and capture the firing pin when the slide comes back forward. At this point, the trigger is usually still completely depressed, but since the connector has been displaced, the trigger bar is in the up position, retaining the firing pin. Now, if everything works correctly, the slide ends its forward stroke, the trigger is released, and the whole trigger bar is brought forward by the partial expansion of the firing pin spring. We have just come back to the starting point. And here comes the tricky part. At the end of the forward stroke of the slide, the trigger block button hits the trigger bar and is pushed all the way in the process. Now, if the button opposes too much resistance, the downward force it exerts on the trigger bar is enough to rotate it to the firing pin release position, and since the slide is by that time fully closed, a new round is immediately fired, and that's the reason for the full auto behavior. Luckily, if the trigger is released, the firing immediately stops, but the phenomenon is nonetheless quite dangerous, and I would have preferred the gun to jam instead of going full auto. Anyway, let's recap what we've learned today. The Glock 32 in 357 SIG is actually a comfortable and accurate gun. 40 Smith & Wesson barrels are safe to interchange, but I'm not entirely sure if accuracy might suffer from it. And finally, you should never get unqualified people to work on your guns. If you would like to see more videos like these, the only way is subscribing now to the channel. Remember that YouTube doesn't really like guns, so they will very rarely suggest my videos unless you are subscribed, preferring some politically correct stuff like painting your fingernails pink or learning how to walk with high heels. Anyway, that's all for today. See you next time. Bye.